Hey everyone, I do apologise for not being in today. If Mr. Davis didn't tell you, I did have COVID. Well, I tested positive last week. I am now negative, but I am still very ill with COVID. So unfortunately, I'm not in, but I did not want you to go without a geography teacher to explain the last few lessons of this booklet and of our last topic, urban futures. So hence this video today. So I want to start off with page 57, if you could turn to that for me, please. And I know that you may have covered or looked at this in detail with Mr. Davis, but I just want to go through some key information to refresh our mind. So for both the Birmingham and the Rio de Janeiro case studies, you do need to know challenges for the people living in these cities, and this could be challenges to their quality of life, their housing, their health, and so on. So one of the main challenges Rio de Janeiro does face is the challenges its favela neighbourhoods pose. So favela is the term we give for these squatter settlements within Rio de Janeiro, so the makeshift homes on illegally sourced land. Life in these favelas can be hard. These are very close together housing. They have a very high population density. So population density refers to the number of people who live on a kilometre square of land. So a kilometre square of land is around about the size of Donington, and we're looking at a very high population density, so a lot of people on a small amount of space. Being so close together ensures that disease spreads very quickly. Related to this, infant mortality rates, so the rate of under 1-year-olds who die per 1,000 births a year, is very high, and it's currently 50 per 1,000. And this is related to disease affecting the vulnerable first, and also a lack of healthcare in some areas. There is also limited waste collection, which we'll go into, which also increases the risk of disease. And you can see on figure 1 that there's a lot of litter on the streets, waste collection is poor, and this may spread diseases to water sources. In the poorest areas of Rio, 10% of people do not have access to freshly piped water, and 50% lack proper sanitation. So sanitation refers to having sewerage, so toilets that are connected to sewer pipes, as well as having clean water for showers, taps, baths, sinks, etc. So in many cases this means that people go to the toilet in the streets, human waste flows through the streets, and this all adds to disease spreading quickly. 30% of people do not have access to any electricity, so they do not have any electricity wires connected to their homes. And in some areas where people can't afford to connect to electricity, they tap into mains electricity illegally. So you can see this on figure 2, which I'll just zoom in. So you can see this just mess of wires as many people try to tap into the mains box down here. The main issue from this is this causes electrical fires. Many homes, as we mentioned, are makeshift, so there are no building regulations, which means their homes may be made out of flammable material, as well as having a high population density. These houses are literally on top of each other and next to each other, and fires can spread very quickly and have a very large impact on human life in the favelas. If we turn over to page 58. So, as we mentioned, there are poor quality houses. These have no building regulations whatsoever, they are makeshift. And in the favelas, many are built on the side of the hills in Rio. Rio de Janeiro is an interesting city in terms of its geography. Rio has, to the north, many mountains and hills, and to the south, it has the ocean, the sea. So the actual amount of flat land that is available in Rio is very, very small. They are completely trapped by mountains on one side and the sea the other, which means if you do not own any of this land, you do not have anywhere else to build but on these mountain sides. This is risky because this puts you at risk of landslides, so following heavy rain, when the land becomes more fluid, it can flow down the side of hills, and if your home's in the way, it will destroy it. In the case of 2010, it destroyed 1,000 homes, and people died. They were either inside their homes when they collapsed, or they were buried. And finally, crime. Crime is a big challenge for Rio, especially in the favelas. Favelas have many crime organisations, so when we say crime organisations, we're talking about gangs and gang warfare, as well as drug cartels. So drug cartels are organisations that sell and transport drugs. I'll write those in. As a result, the number of crimes that happen, the crime rate, very high. Violent crimes are very common, so we're looking at assault and armed robbery, so the use of guns, and this is mostly due to gangs fighting each other, trying to control the drug trafficking in favelas, so who gets to sell where, who gets certain land, so on. Due to this very violent outlook, the murder rate is also high. It's 34 per 100,000 people. And it's the highest in Brazil at the moment, and has caused Rio de Janeiro to be called the murder capital of Brazil. As well as these homes being makeshift, many don't have proper security. They do not have locks, they do not have security alarms and CCTV that we might see more common in other countries like ACs. As a result, vandalism, so breaking windows, and also theft or burglary of possessions is very common for people living in certain favelas. Okay, so we've gone through some issues to life in the favelas. I now want you to have a go at question 1 and 2 on page 59. So in your exercise book, I want you to have a go at the challenges of Rio's favelas. I want you to be really aware of your development of these challenges. So if you are going to, for instance, talk about they've got a high population density, remember that in our mind maps, the arrows almost mean this leads to. And that's how I always try to think about it when I do mind maps. So this will help you develop your impacts, but you might also link some of these impacts together. Once you have detailed what the challenges of Rio's favelas are, I want you to think about which challenge the state government for Rio de Janeiro needs to tackle first. What is their priority? So when you're justified, so when you're backing up your answer using connectors such as because, and this will mean that, your main argument is why is that more pressing than all the other challenges of the favelas? Why does that need to be fixed first? So as I previously mentioned, there is poor sewerage in Rio de Janeiro. To be exact, if we take into account the favelas as well as the other buildings within the city, 1 in 3 of the 10 million people who live in the city don't have any connection to sewage system. They have no pipes going from their toilet to be cleaned. They have no piped water. So we're looking at 30% of the city, around about 3 million people. And currently, only about half of the city's waste is treated. So when we say waste is treatment, it's taken to a treatment plant, Any toxic waste is filtered from the sewage. Any what we call grey water, so this is water that may have things like soaps in it, but nothing toxic to life, can then go into the ocean, go into the sea, and be recycled. This isn't happening in Rio de Janeiro. And not surprisingly, diarrheal diseases, so diarrhea, and childhood sickness are very common just from living in the city. The many rivers that actually do flow through Rio de Janeiro and go into the sea, which is called Guanabara Bay, have been declared biologically dead. So we think about what we know about the word biological. Bio means living things. So biologically dead means nothing lives. Nothing survives in the rivers of Rio de Janeiro just because of the amount of toxic waste and human waste that has gone into these rivers. And they flow through the rivers, and tons of raw sewage pour into the sea every single day. In the sea, there are high levels of viruses, so people can get ill. There are algae blooms. So this is green material, algae that floats on the top of the surface of the ocean, and it stops light from actually getting into the ocean. So this can have an impact on marine life of Guanabara Bay. And we also have an issue that there is industrial contamination. There is chemicals that are toxic, as well as floating rubbish, floating debris. And you can see that in figure 5, there's a lot of debris that is just floating on the surface next to some quite nice tourism buildings. When Rio de Janeiro won the bid for the 2016 Olympics, only one waste treatment plant was fully in operation. So in 2016, they only had one waste treatment plant for a city of 10 million. Instead of the 7 that were pledged by the city when it bid for the Olympics in 2007. And whilst there has been more work done in the last 6 years, they still suffer from high contamination of rivers and of Guanabara Bay surrounding the city. So what your teacher will put on now is a YouTube video that goes through some more information about the pollution of the nearby sea. And this takes us to question 3 and 4. So question 3 says, explain why Guanabara Bay is highly polluted. For this answer, I want you to be very aware of the source we have just read, so the paragraph we've just read. In your exam, you may be given articles or a piece of text to read and be asked a question using this text. So I want you to be very aware of using evidence from the text. So when we say evidence, you have been given some statistics that may help your answer, and you've also been given some dates. So this should help you to be really detailed and also back yourself up. Another thing to consider, in terms of the location of Copacabana, the area of Rio de Janeiro that is more affluent, that is next to the beach, people go there on holiday. This borders Guanabara Bay, this sea that we've just talked about that has high pollution. I want you to explain the impact this will have on tourism. So we're looking at the holiday industry in Rio de Janeiro. Be aware of the money that comes from this and also employment, especially when we think about Rashina and Copacabana. Okay, so if you now turn to page 61, we're now at the end of the Rio de Janeiro case study. And similar to Birmingham, we now need to know one way of making Rio de Janeiro more sustainable. And when we refer to the term sustainable, this is trying to improve the quality of life for those living in Rio. But as it is sustainable, we know that anytime we see sustainable, this means now and in the future. So we're looking at the long-term success of this strategy. So, as we previously mentioned, the main challenge Rio has faced and is facing is that 24% of the people who live there live in informal housing. They live in the favelas, these squatter settlements. And we know they have issue of diseases spreading. This is from living very close to each other and also not having any good sewerage. They have issues with landslide destroying homes and crimes from the drug cartels and the gangs. So we're going to look at this one method, this one project that was put in place to try and improve Rio de Janeiro. And we're going to look at the Favela Bairro project. And this has been going on since 1995 and is now being wrapped up in the last few years. So in 1995, the Rio de Janeiro state government realised they could no longer ignore the favelas that had grown on the outskirts. So previously, they had said, these favelas don't exist. They are on land that is ours and they are illegally squatting there. We don't need to help them. We don't need to provide them with anything. But as these favelas grew, the government realised that they were here to stay and that they actually did need to improve these areas to improve quality of life for the whole city. We've already seen the knock-on effects the favelas have on Guanabara Bay, the sea. So they started a scheme which is the Favela Bairro project. This is Portuguese and literally translates to slum to neighbourhood project. Favela means slum, Bairro means neighbourhood in Portuguese. This scheme aimed to improve favela neighbourhoods to make the city more sustainable. So they thought, if we improve the neighbourhoods, we'll make quality of life better now and in the future for everyone. So you need to know two things about the Favela Bairro project for your revision. You need to know what was done, as well as knowing what the success was. So you need to know why it is successful, why potentially it wasn't successful. And you could be asked a question about either. You may be asked to explain one method of making a EDC or LIDC city more sustainable, or you may get asked to evaluate the success or the sustainability of one strategy to improve an EDC city. So be very aware that you need to know both. So we'll look at first of all what the Favela Bairro project did. So the Favela Bairro project was quite unique when it came to improving a favela, because it did not encourage knocking them down. It favoured upgrading the favelas rather than knocking them down, demolition and rehousing the people that other squatter settlements had tried to do. Upgrading means that they provide people with the materials and skills to improve their own housing. So they don't actually go in, knock a house down and build a new one for them. They say, here's some materials, here's some money, here's how you do it, improve your own home. They do build some things, so they do try to install basic infrastructure, so these public services such as paved roads and electricity for all and water pipes and sewage pipes. So the basic public services are there and people then improve their own homes. All improvements that are built are chosen by the residents, and this is very important. They set up neighbourhood associations, so these are the people who live in the favelas, who work, and they make the decisions on which areas need the improvements, which need what. So all decisions are made by the people who live there for them. The Favela Bairro project gave residents access to credit to allow inhabitants to buy materials such as bricks and roofing. So when we say credit, they are given money, but this money is just to buy materials or to improve their homes. Hillsides were secured, so those homes that were built on areas that may have landslides, or if they couldn't secure the houses, they were having to give people money to relocate their homes if necessary. So this was only a small number of people who had to actually leave. Roads, as we mentioned, were installed, they were paved. Roads were also widened. So one issue that Rio had in their favelas is that these were makeshift homes, they had very small alleyways, so if people were ill or if there was crime, police cars and ambulances couldn't get into certain areas very easily. So this helped improve the speed of emergency services. Access to water supply and drainage system was built, so they tried to ensure that all homes had access to sewerage. No human waste would then be affecting this area. Okay. Services were also put in place and staffed by residents, this is also very important, such as daycare and after-school schemes. This was not only providing jobs for residents, but it also meant that children were looked after and parents could go find work to be able to make more money, to be able to improve their lives. They also put in place adult education classes to improve literacy, to improve the ability to read and write. And this improved people's chance of gaining formal employment. Finally, they introduced something called a pacifying police unit, and this was a special set of police officers who were set up, and their aim was to rid the favela of crime lords and patrol the community. So they wanted to get rid of the gangs and the cartels. So what I want you to do first, now you've read through what they did, I want you to make the following table. And I want you to think, in bullet points, what does the project do to improve housing, health, education and employment, and crime levels? So you have very easily accessible to you the main points of what this project does. Okay, and then finally, as we mentioned, you need to know what the project does. We now need to know what the success is. So when it says, did the project make the city more sustainable, we want to know why it is successful and why it is not a success, why it is unsuccessful. So you need to know the arguments for and against it. So standard of living has increased for residents, and this was their main point. They wanted to improve quality of life. With improved sanitation, we now have seen a reduction of disease. There's less disease spreading in the communities. Infant mortality rate, so those number of children dying under the age of 1, has decreased, and life expectancy, so the average age you live to, has increased. Today, after all the years of trying to improve homes, almost all the houses in Regina are made of concrete and brick, and the most dangerous homes on hillsides have been removed. As a result, residents are now less vulnerable to landslides or things like storms destroying their homes. Most houses have access to basic sanitation, plumbing and electricity. They have those access to public infrastructure. So if I just go to figure 2, you can see not only have these homes been changed, you can see that they're now made out of bricks, they've got glass windows, we've got paved roads, we've got lighting, and these areas are improving. Less people have to illegally tap into electricity supplies. As a result, less blackouts now occur, and I want to include also Less electrical fires now occur from trying to overpower the areas, and also employment has increased. So childcare has really helped, as well as also getting these skills from adult education classes. People living in the favelas now make up 2/3 of the tourism sector in Rio de Janeiro. So 2/3 of those who work in the holiday sector now live in the favelas. So they may work in restaurants, in the hotels, tour guides, beach vendors, so on. 2/3 now live in the favelas. So a lot of people have now gained employment. So these are some of the successes, and it has had a lot of successes. But there have been some issues. With everything, it hasn't been perfect. So whilst people could access credit to buy material, they could buy the bricks and the concretes, many people lacked the skills in housing construction and didn't take advantage of this. It took a very long year, it's been going on since 1995, to improve almost all the homes in the favelas. It could have happened much quicker, and many homes did not take advantage of this quick enough. There are still homes in favelas which have not been improved. Whilst the government did build infrastructure, they did build sewage and electricity lines, this has not been maintained. So if it fails, if it stops working, the locals often lack skills to fix the issue. So it remains broken, it remains not working. The policing unit has been a big issue for the favelas. So the PPU was a pacifying police unit that they brought in to try get rid of the drug lords, the crime organisations, and make the favelas safer. They did remove the crime lords. But the crime lords had actually been the ones who had offered protection and some sense of order in favelas. And as a result, gangs were now fighting for control and gang violence increased. It also was reported that some of the officers were accepting bribes to allow criminal behaviour to continue. This whole scheme, so giving money for resources, providing childcare, policing unit, and so on, cost $2 billion over the period of the project. And this is very expensive for the government, and there are still many favelas that are growing, that have poor conditions, that don't have access to sewage. When we already looked, that's 30% of people, and have high amounts of poverty. So they still live without enough means for a successful and improved quality of life. Okay, so the last thing that you need to do is to make a table to evaluate whether the favela borough project made the city more sustainable. So essentially I want to know the successes and why it isn't a success. You can do this in bullet points, but remember, this will be your basis for any 6 to 8 mark questions that ask you to either evaluate or to assess the success or sustainability. So this is almost like the plan you would make in your actual exam. The last question asks you to suggest some improvements that the government could have made to the project. This would make a very good conclusion to an 6 or 8 mark question about the success. You could develop using your connectives why it is sustainable, why it isn't sustainable, and overall say what else could be done.